Ever stop to think about the sheer volume of social stuff we process every single day?
Oh, constantly.
From just, fleeting impressions of strangers to keeping up with friends and family online. It's nonstop.
It really is a barrage.
How do our brains not just completely short circuit? Let's dive into that. How? Because, well, it turns out there's a whole field dedicated to it. Social cognition.
Exactly. Social cognition is all about the mental tools we use, the ways we interpret, analyze, remember, use information about the social world.
Right.
Think of it like our brain's operating system just for people and interactions.
Okay.
And researchers in this area, they're trying to figure out the fundamentals.
Yeah.
How do we sift through all that social noise? How do we quickly form ideas about others?
Yeah, and what makes us think people act the way they do?
Precisely. And even those hidden traps, the biases in our thinking that can lead us astray.
And this deep dive is designed specifically for you, the listener, to pull back the curtain on one of the most fundamental ways our minds make sense of it all. Schemas. Schemas, yeah.
Now, this might sound a bit academic, but trust me, you use these every single moment of every single day.
Absolutely.
Imagine schemas as your brain's personal filing system for everything social. They're these underlying structures that hold our general knowledge and expectations about the world, about people.
Mm-hmm. Built up from experience.
Built up from everything we've experienced, exactly.
Well, that's a great analogy, the filing system. And it's crucial to realize that schemas aren't just dry facts we can, recite.
Right.
They also include our assumptions, those little mental leaps we make to connect the dots when we're encountering new people or situations.
Okay.
They're constantly running in the background, kind of helping us anticipate what might happen next.
And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack the different kinds of these mental filing systems.
Yeah, the different types.
We'll look at how we categorize individuals, how we see ourselves, our understanding of different groups.
Roles people play. Exactly. The expectations we have for people in specific roles, and even those unspoken scripts we follow in everyday situations. It's like peeking into the control room of our social lives.
That's a good way to put it.
So let's start with how we wrap our heads around other people. The sources discuss person schemas. What are these all about?
Okay, so person schemas are essentially the mental blueprints we have for understanding other people's personalities.
Blueprints.
Yeah. These can be highly specific, like your detailed understanding of your best friend, or much more general, like your idea of what, say, a creative type might be like.
Uh-huh.
And these schemas allow us to quickly categorize people and, importantly, make predictions about how they might behave based on the traits we associate with them.
So if I have a well-defined schema for someone I think is reliable, I'll probably expect them to be punctual and follow through.
Exactly.
The text even mentions someone like Mahatma Gandhi. We all have a schema, right?
Oh.
A sort of mental picture of the kind of person he was known to be.
Precisely. Through our observations and interactions, we build these person schemas, and they provide us with a sense of order and predictability in our social world.
Mm-hmm.
They help us go beyond just what we immediately see.
Okay. Now, shifting gears a bit, how do we understand ourselves? The sources talk about self-schemas. That feels like it has to be pretty central.
Oh, absolutely central.
Mm.
Self-schemas are our own self-concept, the organized collection of knowledge and beliefs we hold about ourselves based on our past experiences.
So who I think I am.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Think of them as the core traits and characteristics that you believe define who you are. What's really interesting, though, is that these self-schemas aren't totally fixed.
Oh.
They can shift depending on the context. You might have a very confident, assertive self-schema at work, but maybe a more reserved one when you're around your oldest friends, for example.
That completely resonates, yeah. I definitely feel like different sides of me come out depending on who I'm with and where I am.
Most people do.
Okay, so we've got schemas for others and for ourselves. What happens when we think about entire groups of people? That's where group schemas, or, well, stereotypes, come into play, right?
Precisely. Group schemas, often called stereotypes, are the mental frameworks we have about members of a particular social group or category.
Okay.
These schemas contain the traits, characteristics, even expected behaviors that we associate with people in those groups, whether it's based on their job, their nationality, religion, whatever way we categorize people socially.
And these can be really broad strokes, can't they? Sometimes painting with a very wide brush.
They definitely can be.
The text mentions examples like thinking about people from a particular region or, a religious background. It sounds like these schemas can have a pretty significant impact on how we initially perceive and interact with individuals we place into these groups.
That's a critical point. These group schemas can be incredibly influential, in our social interactions, and it's really important to be aware of how they might be shaping our perceptions, maybe unconsciously.
Right. Awareness is key there. Okay, moving on. The sources also discuss role schemas. How are these different from our schemas about individual people or entire groups?
Well, role schemas are specifically focused on the expectations we hold for people who occupy particular roles within a group or society.
Like a job title or...
Yeah, or a social role. Think about the mental script you have for interacting with a librarian or a police officer or a sports coach.
Okay.
These schemas help us anticipate how people in these specific roles are likely to behave. It's interesting, too. Fisk's work back in the late 90s suggested that when we first encounter someone in a role, we might rely more on obvious cues, like their uniform or title.
Physical stuff.
Right. But as we get to know them better, our understanding shifts more towards trait-based schemas, what kind of person they are within that role.
I see. So initially, my schema of a chef might just be someone wearing the hat and coat.
Mm-hmm.
But as I get to know a specific chef, my schema might expand to include traits like passionate or demanding or meticulous.
Exactly. The schema becomes richer, more personalized with experience.
Got it. Finally, we have event schemas, also known as scripts. These sound like they're all about navigating the flow of everyday situations.
Precisely. Event schemas, or scripts, are our mental outlines for the typical sequence of actions and behaviors in common social situations.
Like going to a restaurant.
Perfect example. Or going to a coffee shop, attending a meeting, even just greeting someone you know. You have a script for that.
Okay.
The text gives a good example of the expected interactions between teachers and students in a typical classroom setting. These scripts get activated almost automatically when we enter these situations,
right,
helping us navigate them smoothly because we have a general sense of what to expect and how we should probably act. It's like having a mental choreography for social events.
It's like having an internal checklist, kind of, for how things usually go. So with all these different types of schemas constantly running in the background, what kind of impact do they actually have on how we process all the social information coming our way?
Oh, the impact is substantial. Firstly, schemas are like our brain's efficiency experts.
Okay.
They help us manage the sheer flood of information we encounter daily. Our social world is constantly throwing stimuli at us, right?
Yeah, impossible to process it all.
Exactly. We can't possibly process everything in detail.
No.
So schemas act as a filter, directing our attention to what's most relevant for understanding a situation, storing it, making sense of it, recalling it later. This makes our decision-making processes much faster and usually more efficient.
So they're essential for cutting through that information overload. The text also mentions that schemas are theory-driven. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
This is a really key insight. Because our schemas are built from our past experiences and knowledge, they essentially act like pre-existing theories that shape how we interpret new situations.
Theories.
Yeah. As Fisk and Taylor pointed out years ago, we don't always approach new social information with a completely blank slate. Instead, our existing schemas subtly influence how we understand and react in new social encounters. We're often operating based on our schema-driven assumptions without even consciously realizing it.
Wow.
It's like wearing tinted glasses. Our past experiences color how we see the present.
That's a powerful idea. So my past experiences are constantly shaping how I perceive what's happening right now. What about memory? How do schemas affect what I remember and maybe what I forget?
Schemas have a significant and reconstructive effect on our memory.
Reconstructive?
Yeah. We don't typically store a perfect recording of every social interaction. Instead, we tend to remember the key elements that activated a particular schema. Then, when we try to recall the event later, our schema can actually fill in any missing details. Research in this area, like Cohen's work back in the 80s, showed we're more likely to remember details that fit with our existing schemas and might inadvertently forget or even distort things that don't quite align. It's as if our memory tries to create a coherent story that fits our existing mental frameworks.
So our memories aren't like video recordings. They're more like reconstructions where our existing knowledge fills in the gaps. That could definitely explain why two people can remember the same event so differently.
Absolutely. It's a major factor.
What about when we're trying to size people up, making inferences about their personalities or intentions? How do schemas play in there?
Schemas are crucial for making these kinds of inferences. As the tech highlights, there are often gaps in our understanding of social situations, right?
Sure, always.
And our schemas step in to help us bridge those gaps. If we're missing some information about someone, we'll often make assumptions that are consistent with our existing schema of that person or that type of person to create a more complete picture.
Okay, so like the example in the text.
Right.
If your roommate is a dedicated sports person, you might infer things about their discipline or competitiveness even if you haven't seen direct evidence of it.
Precisely that. Or if you know someone is a doctor, you might automatically infer they're intelligent and detail-oriented even before you've had a lengthy conversation. We fill in the blanks based on the schema.
That makes perfect sense. We're constantly making these little mental leaps based on what we already think we know. And how do these schemas connect to our gut feelings or overall judgments about people?
Certain schemas, particularly person schemas, are very closely intertwined with our evaluations and emotions.
How so?
Well, when a particular schema is activated, say, your schema of someone you deeply trusted can automatically lead you to view that person and their actions in a positive light.
Okay.
The text points out how schemas often carry an inherent positive or negative valence, influencing our feelings and overall assessment of people and situations.
So my schemas can really color my emotional responses as well. Finally, the source you talk about schemas being integrated and stable. What does that tell us about how they work and how easily they might change?
Right. So schemas develop and become stronger with repeated experiences. Over time, the different pieces of information within a schema become tightly connected, forming an integrated whole.
Like a web of ideas.
Exactly, a well-connected web. Because of these strong associations, even activating a single aspect of a schema, one piece of information can bring the entire framework online.
Right.
Furthermore, once schemas are well established and frequently used, they tend to become quite resistant to change.
Stubborn things.
They can be, yes, even when we encounter new information that contradicts them. Our existing ways of thinking about the social world can be surprisingly persistent. Fisk and Dyer talked about this too.
It sounds like once a schema takes root, it can be quite difficult to dislodge. Now, we've talked about schemas as this foundational way we process social information, but the sources also discuss different modes of social thought processing. What are the main ways our brains approach this?
Okay, yeah. The text emphasizes two main approaches, or maybe distinctions. First, there's the continuum model.
Continuum, like a scale.
Exactly. Imagine a sliding scale. On one end, we have processing that's very category-driven, meaning we rely heavily on our existing schemas to quickly understand a situation. This is sometimes called schematic processing.
Okay. The quick and easy way.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
On the other end, we have more data-driven processing, sometimes called systematic processing, where we pay close attention to individual pieces of information and analyze them more carefully, more deliberately.
Right.
The model from Fisk and Newberg suggests we tend to use that quick, schema-driven processing when the situation is fairly straightforward, maybe less important to us. However, when things are confusing or the situation has significant implications and we really need to be accurate, we're more likely to shift towards that more effortful, data-driven processing.
So if I'm just making a quick judgment about someone I see in passing, I might rely heavily on my existing schemas, fast and frugal.
Probably.
But if it's someone I'm going to be working with closely on a critical project, I'll probably pay much more attention to their individual skills and actions, right? Put more effort in.
Exactly. You'll move along the continuum towards data-driven. The second key distinction is between automatic and controlled processing.
Okay, automatic and controlled.
Controlled processing is that deliberate, logical, conscious, and effortful way of thinking. You know you're doing it.
Like working through a problem.
Right. Automatic processing, in contrast, is much faster, requires less mental effort, and often operates outside of our conscious awareness.
Outside awareness. Okay.
And research, like Devine's work, has shown that many of our social stereotypes, for example, can be automatically activated when we encounter members of the relevant social groups.
Activated automatically?
Yes, even if we consciously try to be unbiased.
Yeah.
Even using things like subliminal cues can trigger them. It's like a reflex in our thinking.
That's a bit unsettling, the idea that these automatic associations can just kick in without us even realizing it.
It is. And the research even suggests that this automatic activation can occur in individuals who constantly reject prejudice, both high and low prejudice people, which highlights how deeply ingrained these associations can become just through societal exposure. It really underscores the power of these automatic processes in shaping our initial reactions and perceptions.
So even with our best intentions, these automatic associations can still be influencing our thinking in subtle ways. Now, to navigate all this social information efficiently, the sources mentioned we use heuristics. What exactly are these, and how do they relate back to the schemas we've been discussing?
Right. Heuristics. They're essentially mental shortcuts, quick and easy strategies that our brains use to make judgments and decisions, especially when we're faced with a lot of information or, when we're under time pressure.
Rules of thumb.
Exactly. Good way to put it. Rules of thumb that help us simplify complex problems. And they definitely play a role in which schemas we might activate in a given situation. If a certain schema comes to mind easily, perhaps because of a heuristic, we might be more likely to apply it.
Okay, so they help us quickly decide which mental framework, which schema to use in a given situation. What are some of the main types of heuristics that the sources highlight?
Okay, one important one is the availability heuristic.
Availability.
Yeah. This refers to how we tend to base our judgments on information that is most readily available or easily retrieved from our memory.
What comes to mind first?
Sort of, yeah. But it's not just about how often we've encountered something, but also how easily specific examples come to mind. Schwartz and his colleagues emphasize this ease of retrieval aspect.
Okay.
So if vivid examples of something are easily accessible in our memory, we might overestimate its likelihood or frequency.
Ah, I see. So if I can easily think of news stories about, say, plane crashes, I might mistakenly believe air travel is more dangerous than it statistically is just because those dramatic images are so available in my mind.
That's a classic example, yes. Another key heuristic is the representativeness heuristic.
Representativeness.
We use this when we're trying to categorize something or someone. And we tend to focus on how similar it is to our existing mental prototype, our schema of that category.
Okay.
If something shares many characteristics with a particular schema, we might quickly assume it belongs to that category, even if other information like base rates suggests otherwise. We go with the resemblance.
So if someone I meet seems quiet, likes reading, maybe wears glasses, traits I strongly associate with my schema of a librarian, I might jump to the conclusion that they are a librarian, even without any solid proof, and ignoring how few librarians there are compared to other professions.
Precisely. You're matching to the prototype, sometimes overriding other relevant data. And the final heuristic we should touch on is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic.
Anchoring and adjustment.
This is where we start with an initial piece of information to anchor, and then we adjust our judgment from that starting point.
Okay, makes sense.
The catch is, our adjustments are often insufficient. We don't adjust far enough away from the anchor, so our final judgment tends to remain too close to that initial, possibly arbitrary starting point.
Oh, like the example in the text. Guessing Delhi's population based on knowing Haryana's.
Exactly. If you're given Haryana's population as an anchor, even if you know Delhi is much bigger, your guess for Delhi's population is likely to be heavily influenced, pulled towards that initial anchor number.
Right.
And we also tend to use ourselves, our own experiences and perspectives, as an anchor when judging others, which isn't always accurate.
That makes sense. If I'm trying to figure out how stressed someone else is, my own current stress level might unconsciously become my anchor, my starting point for that judgment.
Very likely, yes.
Now, even with these mental shortcuts and our reliance on schemas, it seems we're still susceptible to making errors in our social thinking. Our systems aren't perfect.
Far from it.
What are some of the common reasons why our social cognition can go wrong?
Well, despite our desire to be rational, several factors can lead to inaccuracies in our social judgments. Often it stems from our tendency to conserve mental effort, taking those shortcuts.
Yeah, cognitive misers.
Right, or other psychological biases creep in. One interesting idea mentioned is the cognitive experiential self theory.
Okay, what's that?
It suggests that we often rely more heavily on intuitive, gut feeling, experience-based, thinking the experiential system rather than deliberate, logical analysis, the rational system when evaluating social situations, even when logic might serve us better.
So, feeling over logic sometimes.
Pretty much. Think about someone who have lucky shoes they believe help them win at sports, even though there's no logical connection. That's the experiential system overriding a more rational assessment.
We probably all have some of those intuitive beliefs that don't always stand up to strict logic. What else can lead us astray in our social thinking?
The information we pay attention to can also play a role. Interestingly, information that goes against our expectations about certain roles.
Violates the schema.
Exactly, violates the schema. That can actually capture our attention more and be better remembered than information that just confirms our expectations.
Mm.
For example, as Bardock and Park's research touched on regarding gender roles, we might be more likely to notice and remember a traditionally assertive person showing unexpected kindness, or vice versa, than someone just acting consistently with expectations.
Okay.
Now, while this sensitivity to inconsistency can be informative, focusing too much on these unexpected, maybe atypical instances can sometimes lead to skewed perceptions of the person or the group overall.
So the unusual can be more memorable, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's more typical or representative. Makes sense.
What about our tendency to focus on the negative aspects of things? I feel like that's a big one.
It really is. That's known as the negativity bias. We tend to give more weight, more importance to negative information compared to positive information of seemingly equal intensity.
So a few negative comments about someone, or one bad experience, can have a much stronger impact on our overall impression than numerous positive ones. It's like our brains are wired to be more sensitive to potential threats or negative outcomes. Danger signals flash brighter.
That definitely feels true. Bad news often seems to stick with us more than good news. The sources also mention something called the planning fallacy. I have a feeling a lot of us can relate to this one.
Oh, absolutely. The planning fallacy is our persistent tendency to underestimate the amount of time it will take us to complete a future task.
Guilty as charged.
We all are, probably. We often focus on the ideal scenario, how quickly things should go in the future, rather than looking back realistically at how long similar tasks have actually taken us in the past. And even when we are reminded of past delays, we often attribute them to specific external factors from that time, rather than adjusting our general optimistic bias about future planning.
Definitely sounds familiar. This time will be different.
Exactly that thinking.
What about the idea that there can be potential costs of thinking too much? That seems a bit counterintuitive. Shouldn't more analysis be better?
You'd think so, but not always. There are situations where overanalyzing things, especially our feelings or preferences, can actually lead to less accurate judgments or worse decisions compared to going with our initial, more intuitive assessments.
Really?
Yeah. Research, like the JAM study by Wilson and Schooler, has shown that sometimes when we consciously try to dissect why we like something or the reasons behind our choices too much, we can actually end up focusing on less important factors, confusing ourselves, and making decisions that we're less satisfied with in the long run. It's as if too much conscious thought can sometimes disrupt our more natural, perhaps more accurate gut feelings about simple preferences.
So there's a sweet spot when it comes to analysis. Overthinking, especially about subjective things, can actually be detrimental sometimes.
It seems so, yes.
What about counterfactual thinking? That sounds like something we all engage in from time to time, the what-ifs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Counterfactual thinking involves imagining alternative scenarios, thinking about what if things had gone differently, or if only something else had happened after an event has already occurred. Now, while it can sometimes be useful for learning from mistakes and planning better for the future, if I had studied more, I would have passed.
Right.
It can also lead to feelings of regret, disappointment, or even guilt if we focus too much on negative alternative outcomes. If only I hadn't said that. It's that dwelling on could-have-beens.
I know I've spent my fair share of time replaying past events in my head, imagining different possibilities. Finally, the sources discuss magical thinking. That sounds a bit different from the other types of errors. Less logical, maybe.
It is definitely less rooted in logic. Magical thinking involves making irrational assumptions that are often based on association or appearance rather than causal reasoning.
Okay.
Two common principles mentioned behind magical thinking are the law of similarity, the idea that things that resemble each other must also share deeper underlying properties.
Like the lizard-shaped biscuit example in the text, perhaps?
Yeah.
Feeling hesitant to eat it?
Exactly. The appearance influences the feeling about its essence. The other is the law of contagion, the belief that once things have been in physical contact, properties can transfer and they continue to influence each other even after the contact ends.
Like the example about being reluctant to wear something previously worn by someone disliked or feared, even after it's cleaned. Like the HIV patient's coat idea.
Precisely. The belief that some essence or property lingers through past contact. These kinds of magical thinking beliefs, while perhaps comforting or intuitive sometimes, can lead to unusual or illogical judgments and behaviors when applied inappropriately.
Those definitely highlight some of the less logical, more well, magical corners of our minds.
They certainly do.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful exploration into the fascinating world of social cognition. Really fascinating.
It's a deep topic.
We've journeyed through the landscape of schemas, those fundamental mental frameworks that shape how we understand the social world. Looking at the different types that guide our perceptions of people, ourselves, groups, roles, and events.
We covered a lot of ground there.
We also examined the two primary ways our brains process social information, that continuum from automatic category-based thinking to more controlled data-driven thinking.
Right, the continuum model and the automatic versus controlled distinction.
And the crucial role of heuristics as our mental shortcuts, those rules of thumb.
Availability, representativeness, anchoring.
Yeah.
Essential tools, but with pitfalls.
Exactly. And finally, we delved into the various ways our social thinking can sometimes go astray, from the negativity bias and planning fallacy to the quirks of counterfactual and magical thinking.
All those potential sources of error.
Yeah.
Exactly. And by understanding these underlying cognitive processes, hopefully gain a much deeper appreciation for the intricate ways in which we navigate our daily social interactions and build our understanding of both ourselves and the people around us.
Yeah.
It really is like getting a peek under the hood of our social minds.
Absolutely. So, for you, our listener, here's a final thought to ponder as we wrap up. Take a moment today, or maybe over the next few days, to consider how these cognitive processes we've discussed might be subtly shaping your own perceptions and decisions in your everyday interactions.
Mm-hmm. A little self-reflection.
Yeah. What schemas might you be relying on without even realizing it? Are there certain heuristics, those shortcuts, that tend to guide your judgments more often than others?
Good questions to ask.
And where might your own social thinking be susceptible to some of these common sources of error we talked about?
It's a fascinating look, isn't it, into the invisible machinery that drives our social lives.